Hello, happy noon, everybody, or if you're like me on the West Coast, good morning. I see some people from around the country. So hello, everyone. This is an overview question and answer study session for human geography, just the exam coming up next week. So let's go ahead and get started. I see one question so far, but Primate City is not on the exam because urban geography is not on it. So quickly though, I mean, it's just, it's the biggest city in the country by far, more than twice the size of the next city. A place like London or Paris is considered a primate city, but Joel, not something you'll have to know for the exam. So does anybody have any questions, or I will just go ahead and do a huge, big overview with my slideshow that I have that just is a complete overview. And we'll see how much we can get through. If you have questions, please just throw them in the comments. And I'm going to work here on getting my slideshow up. Hi, Rashika. Okay, I think it's this one. There's two that I can choose from. Okay, so let me make me small and my slideshow big. And then we will just go ahead and get started. So please, happy birthday, Steph, from other people too. I'm going to go ahead and race through an overview of the course. And if you have questions, interrupt me at any moment. And if there's anything else, you can't hear me, can't see something, something's going on, just go ahead and let me know. And here we go. Except I'm just gonna switch one thing real quick here. Sorry, because I was sharing the wrong screen. Sorry. No, hang on, just one. I'm sorry, guys. Bear with me. Sorry, I will be less than 30 seconds and I will get this up and running. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. So devolution, so I can go ahead and start with that. So this is in the political geography unit, and devolution is a process by which political power devolves, which is it goes down from the central power to a more localized or smaller unit of the state. An example would be in a lot of places in the world, there are what are called semi-autonomous regions, like China has one, like Hong Kong and Tibet and Xinjiang province. These places are semi-autonomous. Or a place like Spain that has somewhere like Catalonia or the Basque country. So often there are pushes by more local groups, sometimes ethnic minorities within a state, to have more power. Nope, I'm answering the question here, Rashika. So devolution is the process by which power moves down. So if the central government gives up power and it becomes like if Scotland were fighting, there's been a question whether Scotland would break away from the UK and be independent. And let's say the UK really worried that Scotland was going to gain independence and vote for it. They might go through a devolutionary process by which power is granted to Scotland, partial power, so they can keep it in the state. So just a process by which power is kind of relinquished by the central government and goes partially to a local region or people. Okay, so I'm seeing some questions pop up, which is great, and let me go ahead and get my slideshow in here, and then we will go ahead and do it. Okay. Again, sorry, I'm just confused because it's giving me different versions of my thing. What I want to share so you can see the whole thing is not that, it's this. Okay, now we're good to go. I apologize. So I'll go ahead and answer a couple of those questions. So Abigail, I'm gonna just I'm gonna start with laws of migration once I get through the kind of early stuff here. So we're kind of past the point that this matters for the most part, but this is the regular streaming calendar. I don't know what it will be for next school year, if Pybal is going to change the schedule, but keep checking it out. There's lots of information out there for you. In terms of human geography, after this hour, there's only 2 more streams for human geography. They're both for only folks with Grand Passes. But if you have a Grand Pass, check those out. One is later today. That's FRQ tips and tricks with Amanda. And then Monday, the day before the exam, is the big 5-hour cram session. So those, and please note, again, you need to have a cram pass for those, and those times are Eastern. So if you're like me on the West Coast, subtract 3. And please share us with the world. Like us, share us, tweet us, spread the word about Fiveable so we can keep growing and get more content up there for you. I'm going to quickly go through the exam format, and then we'll take your questions. If you have none, I'll run through the course in roughly that order. So, oh, and let me do this because you don't need to see my big face. It makes sense that you guys see this bigger. So, that's why the primate city question, Joel, that you asked is in this unit 6. That's not on the exam. So those 5 units, those first 5, and I've seen a question that I focus on politics and agriculture. So if I'll kind of answer Abigail's question about migration, and then I will jump to politics and agriculture, and then we'll go from there. Unless, and again, any questions, anytime, just throw them in there. The format is going to be just simply 2 free response questions. As you see, one of them is going to have 1 stimulus to answer, the other will have 2 to respond to, the other will have 2 stimuli. These can be maps, charts, photographs, pictures, with data, information for you to respond to. My main tip, and I know there's going to be the FRQ tips and tricks, is to make sure you are answering the question. Always, 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 they say AP stands for address the prompt. So if it's asking you about a stimulus, make sure you are addressing what it is asking, not what you wish it were asking or hope it was asking. Focus on the question. Easy for people to let go of. Okay, so I'm gonna just jump then. Let me jump to politics. Okay, so I'm gonna cover Unit 4 and Unit 5. And then Abigail, I will be sure if I don't, please remind me. I'll come back and answer about Ravenstein's laws on migration. I have a slide on that, but now that I'm here, we'll just run through Unit 4. So the most basic unit by which geographic space is divided when we talk about political geography is the unit of the state. This is a little confusing, I think, for Americans, since we talk about states like Arizona, Texas, New Jersey, and so on. We call these states because initially when we broke away as the United States, united with a small u, S was a big S, we were really 13 separate states that broke away united together, each really as a sovereign entity. So a state is a sovereign entity. It's a territory with population that governs itself, that is, it's sovereign. That's why California, we are not a state in the sense of political geography because we have sovereignty. The United States has sovereignty. And I'm going to come back to that California thing. So currently there's, roughly, I'll say there's about 200 states in the world. The United Nations, as you see here, has 193. I think it's interesting to note that if we go back to the founding of the United Nations, there were, I forget the exact number, but there were about 50 states in the world. And the rest were virtually all colonies of a handful of those 50 states. So the number of states in the world has kept growing. South Sudan is the newest member of the United Nations. And then you've got the Holy See or the Vatican and Palestinian territories. These are non-member states, which Palestinian territories, we could argue about sovereignty there, whether it's truly a state. But I'm not saying this to be controversial, but if political sovereignty is something they don't necessarily have when they have Israeli military patrolling their territory. So, sorry, I went backwards. The main way states can be talked about politically is you either have a unitary state in which all the political power is held in one place. You see those are the countries on this map in blue. Many countries in the world are unitary. Or you have what's called a federal state, which is like what the United States has, where power is shared between the central government, what we call the federal government in Washington, D.C., and then at the state level. And you are hugely, hugely witnessing federalism right now amidst the coronavirus pandemic response, with states kind of going their own way, and these battles between the federal government and the state governments. Michigan is kind of where we see it maybe the strongest. And yeah, so that's kind of the basic two types of political ways. There's also what can be called a confederation. Switzerland is a confederation. We had a confederacy, the United States, initially when we began, before we had the Constitution. We were under what were called the Articles of Confederation because we were 13 separate states that were united with a shared government, but really most power was held by each individual state. That's called a confederacy, not really a common thing in the world, but again, Switzerland is the most famous confederacy right now. In fact, their technical name is Confederation Helvetica, which is why you see them abbreviated CH. I spent the last 4 years living in Switzerland, so I can tell you more about that. But then you have the idea of the nation and the nation state. So a state is a territory, like I've talked about, what we often just would, in the US, often we call a country. A nation refers to a group of people. Unfortunately, I don't have a slide on this. I'm going to actually go back. This is the end of my culture presentation, but I'm going to just use this map as an example. So this would be the Balkans. Rashika, you asked about Balkanization. This is where it comes from. This is part of the Balkan Peninsula. You see just north of Greece, across the water from Italy. What is shown there is the former country of Yugoslavia. And it was made up of a variety of Slavic peoples. The name Yugoslavia meant land of the Southern Slavs when it was created to unite all these people into a country, into a state, what we would call a multinational state. Because the people that made up the state of Yugoslavia were the biggest group were Serbs, as you see in the chart, but you also had Croats and Slovenes and Bosniaks and Montenegrins and Albanians and Kosovars and all these different nations of people. And a nation is a group of people that feels united by a common identity. There's been controversy recently. California's Governor Gavin Newsom has begun to talk about California as a nation state. So this idea has kind of been brought into the American consciousness a little more. And some people would, so Sarah, I would say to your question, there's not really a difference between a multinational and a multi-ethnic state. It's more or less the same thing. It's just maybe a bit precision of language. When somebody talks about, you could have I guess there is a difference, sort of. A nation is a group that feels a strong sense of shared identity. Some ethnic groups feel that, some don't. So we could take the United States, which complicates all these categories because we're a country of immigrants. So we are absolutely a multi-ethnic state. That's what I was going to say, Sarah. I think you could say the United States is multi-ethnic, but in theory, maybe to some degree, if you're a Polish American or a Greek American or a Chinese American, you're American. So you might be, we are multi-ethnic, we're made up of people of lots of ethnicities, but really those people have a shared national identity, which is American. That's kind of the easy answer. Now, in other countries, there are places, because they're not necessarily made up of immigrants. Yugoslavia, I'll go back to this map, is a perfect example. When this was one country, it didn't look like this. Slovenes migrated into that northwest blue area, and Serbians migrated into that eastern area. I mean, maybe at some long ago point, there were waves of migrations. But it really was that these borders were drawn, and I'm going to talk about subsequent and antecedent borders here in a moment. The borders were drawn around lots of distinct groups that had distinct identities. So that became a multinational state because these groups had individual identities. People didn't necessarily feel Yugoslavian, they felt Croatian. They didn't necessarily feel Yugoslavian, they felt Serb, or Montenegrin. And this broke up when a Serb nationalist named Slobodan Milosevic came to power, and it split up to a series of wars, and now it's a bunch of, in a sense, nation states. Slovenia, that the blue one first to the north there, I was able to visit there, and this is a place that's really not very multi-ethnic. Like, the people there are Slovene. But in general, you can see on this map, they call some of these things nation states, but look at China. They call China a national state. I don't know. I think that's a bit of a diss to the ethnic minorities. But China is, over 90% Han Chinese, one ethnic group, but there are numerous minorities. So I don't know. This is a little strange map, and then there's important minorities. I don't know what makes a minority important, but a place like Mongolia really is largely Mongolians, but you have Russians and you have Chinese. And the deal is, because borders are often artificial, they cannot perfectly match where distinct groups of people live. So it's very hard to create a true nation state where the state's borders go around really a distinct group without there being minorities inside the borders, or some of the people from that state maybe spilling out into other borders. And this ideal of the nation state grew up in the 19th century amid the rise of this idea of national identity, which was really a European ideal as the borders of Europe were changing, and there was a series of the Napoleonic Wars, and that caused nationalism to rise, and people began to really identify with the state that they lived in. This is where we had the rise of things like flags and national anthems and national heroes and true national identity. So that now there is talk of a lot of places in the world being nation states. So you could kind of use two definitions of nation state. One would be a state where the borders really do correspond to that distinct group of people. The other is where the group of people that live in the state really feel their strong sense of identity with that state itself. In that kind of sense, you could have, what you asked, Sarah, like a multi-ethnic state that technically is a nation state. If all those people of various ethnicities feel a really strong connection and identification with that state, you could, in a sense, call it a nation state. So I hope that makes sense, but these are kind of the main terms of states, nations, nation state. And yeah, I'm glad you brought up multinational state. We also talked a lot about multinational empires in history, and a lot of the borders that have been redrawn are because multinational empires split up because of a rise of national identity among the ethnic minorities or national minorities that wanted their own nation states. The other thing we could talk about are stateless nations. The Kurds are often talked about as the largest one in the world, though they have some semi-sovereign territories of their own now, but this is a group of, I want to say about 40 million people. I might be wrong on the number, but they've traditionally been, not traditionally, because these are fairly new nations, but they've historically lived in the land that is now like Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and they're just sort of split up in that region, which is sometimes known as Kurdistan. But they didn't get a nation state out of the borders that broke up the Ottoman Empire, which was a very multinational empire coming out of World War I. But we know from the Romans talked about the Kurds being a distinct group that lived there. So they are a nation, but they don't have their own state. So we call that a stateless nation. A couple random terms. Don't know that these would come up on the exam, but when we talk about boundaries and borders, you have what are called exclaves and enclaves. An exclave is like for the United States, it would be Alaska. It's like a part of our territory that is not contiguous with us. So some countries are split up like this. Like when Pakistan originally was created, when India split, what's now Pakistan was West Pakistan, and what's now Bangladesh was East Pakistan. So in the sense that East Pakistan was kind of seen as an exclave since the capital was in the west. Russia has this tiny one called Kaliningrad, you might have noticed on a map. Hey, what's this little thing over here by Latvia and Lithuania that is labeled as Russia, or like I said, Alaska. So a piece of land that's outside that country's borders. An enclave is a territory that belongs to another state, but it's inside your country. There are tons of these in the world. If you go to Wikipedia, there's just a crazy list of enclaves. The vast majority of which all you will never have heard of. And I can think of like one specific one from when I lived in Switzerland. There's a place called Campione d'Italia, which is a piece of Italy that's in Switzerland. And I knew somebody that lived in there. And it's technically, you're an Italian citizen, even though you're inside Switzerland, just a few miles from Italy. So, and you can see here, like that would be C in the top picture, is an enclave of A, but it's an exclave of country B, and you see that from the colors. Now, in the case of C in the second picture, that's not an enclave because it's not entirely inside either A or D, but it still is an exclave of B. So kind of random, but you never know what they might throw at you. I think more important are the ideas of words. Antecedent versus subsequent, before versus after, in a sense. And here's that picture I was referring to before again. Antecedent borders were drawn really before you had dense settlement. So often, whereas subsequent are drawn after there's already a cultural landscape. So like the borders of Yugoslavia that connected all these people together, that was a subsequent border because there was already a cultural landscape in which there was more Slovenian heritage and ethnicity and national identity and culture over in this area, and Croatian here, and Bosnian here, and Albanian here, and Montenegrin here, and that cultural landscape existed, and you could see where people lived and where they were impacting the culture. And then a border was drawn despite all that. It didn't necessarily reflect. So subsequent borders can be consequent, which can say, oh, we're going to consider the consequences here, and we are going to draw those borders. Now, in a sense, you could say the Yugoslavian border when it was drawn was consequent because it was called Land of the Southern Slavs, Yugoslavia, and it was differentiating them from the Hungarians and the Austrians, who are Magyar and Germanic, not Slavic, for example. Or you could say these were superimposed. They really didn't pay any attention to the fact that, and in this case, I think it's sort of both, but it was superimposed in that it wasn't the people of that region that chose those borders. Those borders were came on from the outside. So we've seen this a lot in the Middle East. And again, you see this largely when we've seen multinational empires split up, or when during decolonization, often you see the term artificial borders used, like in Africa, where colonial borders just became the national borders, and those colonial borders really didn't reflect any understanding of the cultural landscape that was in Africa, which is why you have hundreds of languages spoken in places like Nigeria, and why there's been a lot of struggles between ethnic groups and such in post-colonial Africa. So hopefully my speed's okay, just if it's not. So some nations feel a very strong sense of identity, and some nations feel a weaker sense of national identity. And there are forces in the world that can pull a nation together to feel really strongly united, and we call those centripetal forces. This is maybe a little weird, but the way I could remember this is centripetal has the word petal in it, like petal of a flower, and a flower is usually a nice thing we think of, so centripetal would be something nice, whereas centrifugal forces, I see fugal, and I see feud, like a fight, so that's something that creates disunity. These are obviously scientific forms, so if you know what a centripetal and centrifugal force is in science, it makes perfect sense to you. But, and I've put nationalism here on both lists because a strong sense of national identity can pull a country together. We've seen this rise of nationalism right now in a lot of countries, and in some ways that's pulling countries together. And, an idea like Make America Great, or a war can be a really strong thing to pull a country together. Having a strong sense of a national goal or a national motto, a myth, an icon, national heroes, all these things can be used to pull people together. Central institutions like schools can often instill, that's why we have civics classes, and why we pledge allegiance to the flag, and these types of rituals that take place in schools often do kind of indoctrinate people and create a strong sense of a shared nationhood. And a strong infrastructure can allow a strong national economy. So those are examples of centripetal forces that can pull people together. Centrifugal forces can really pull a country apart, and nationalism can also be a centrifugal force if, for example, you either have persecution of minorities, that can certainly cause some disunity in a country, or sometimes there are ethnic minorities that are pulling for their own autonomy or their own more control or rights, like we see the Catalonians in Spain. So that would be an example of kind of how nationalism could pull a country apart. And geographic fragmentation, if there's not a strong infrastructure, not strong transportation, I use the example of Pakistan when it was split between an east and a west, and that Bangladesh split away because of a civil war, and they felt like they were not acknowledged culturally. The language was different than the national language. They felt ethnically different than the people of the West, even though they shared Islam, which is why they were combined in the country, and they felt like they were neglected. So that was hard for Pakistan to kind of stay united as a country because they were geographically fragmented. That was kind of my overview of political geography. So if there's any, and I see I have some questions, so I'm going to pop into these questions, sorry. So buffer state and a buffer zone. So if there's conflict between two states, let's take North and South Korea, and you have what is called the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, that would be called a buffer zone. And that's created to kind of help keep the peace between two countries that were enemies. A buffer state is a state that's positioned, again, this would be more like in creation of borders, in a sense like when Poland was created, maybe there's somewhat, it's been a country, it's been a state at different times in history, but it was maybe created to keep the peace between Germany and Russia and create a buffer state that would make it less likely for conflict to erupt between those two. So if a state exist between two states that might be created as a state in a way that helps keep the peace between them. So it does the same thing. It's just a state of its own that has its own sovereign government, but its position kind of helps keep the peace between the two neighbors that it's between. I'm going to skip the primate city because it's simply not in the exam, Joseph. That's Heartland and Rimland theory. Yeah. So I see. So these are these geopolitical theories. I was going to throw them in there. I think they're not terribly important. If somebody remembers the guy, I'm blanking on the name of the person that came up with the Heartland theory, so you can throw it in the comments if anyone knows. I forget his name. But this was the idea that whoever controlled the heartland of Eurasia as being kind of the main landmass of Earth, whoever controlled the center and the heartland would control the world. It was kind of this intense time of geopolitics of how to be the strongest force in the world. The Rimland theory came in as a response to that, saying actually coastlines are more important. And somebody just, Harold Mackinder, yeah, I think it's Harold, but don't. Thank you, Michaela. Came up with the Heartland theory was Mackinder, and the Rimland was more that it was important to actually be in control. It's sort of like a game of Risk, if you think of that. It's all about which territory makes you the most powerful in terms of position. So I think I answered multi-ethnic versus multinational. Okay, so, and Michaela, you asked, is the Kurds an autonomous region or a stateless nation? So let me just be specific with my language here. So the Kurds are a group of people. So the Kurds are a nation. Right now, I believe the northern part of Iraq, my current Iraqi geopolitical intelligence is limited, but as things have developed in the war in Iraq, my understanding is that the region of the north is largely controlled by the Kurds, though it is still a part of Iraq. So if they were given their own state and it had its own borders, it was not part of Iraq, then it would simply be a state, and in this case it would be a nation state, because it would be made up of Kurds that felt a strong sense of identity toward that state they lived in, Kurdistan, they would call it. As it is, they have, I believe it's a semi-autonomous region, which means they have some autonomy, but not complete sovereignty or autonomy. The Tibetans are another group. Tibet, I shouldn't say the Tibetans because they don't control much of Tibet, but Tibet is a semi-autonomous region. Hong Kong is a semi-autonomous region. Xinjiang province, where the Uyghurs live in northwest China, is a semi-autonomous region. Trying to think of other, again, it's a bit of a stretch, but in a sense, you could call states in the United States semi-autonomous regions, but we really don't, because we think more like we're a federal system. They share power with the federal government. But in a sense, we are somewhat semi-autonomous. California can do things that Arizona can't. We have a lot of control. So the Kurds are, in a sense, a stateless nation, though they're less stateless than they have ever been since they have now a semi-autonomous region. So, Michaela, I hope that answered your question. And okay, did I get all these questions? Yes, I did. Okay. So I'm going to go into agriculture then, unless there are more questions for me. You can throw them in the comments, or you can keep doing it as a question. So I'm going to go into agriculture. This map shows the agricultural hearths and their spread, where these are the places where agriculture originated. I think it's important to say there wasn't one place. Yes, the Fertile Crescent at the center of this map was an important one, but China was its own agricultural hearth, Papua New Guinea and Southeast Asia, the Andes Mountains, Mesoamerica. There are different places where different groups of crops arose and cultivation methods and spread out from there. So that's one thing to point out. What I realized I don't think I have a slide on it. So I'll just say a note about it. This is kind of what we would call the first agricultural revolution, when agriculture spread out and developed and people went from hunting gathering to farming as a way of life, to cultivation of plants and domestication of animals. The second agricultural revolution took place amidst the Industrial Revolution, somewhat before, during the Industrial Revolution. Some people would say the second agricultural revolution was a necessary prerequisite to free people from the land to be able to move into cities. But this was lots of new crops from the Columbian Exchange coming from the Americas, going global. So new crops available to people that they could grow in new places, as well as natural fertilizers. So there was a huge amount of bird crap, guano being mined in South America, islands off Chile, and being brought back and fertilizing the lands naturally of Europe that had been very depleted. New technology, like the seed drill is very important. And so all these new technologies and methods that allowed a huge increase in food production, which allowed a huge increase in population and pushed people away from farms because you didn't need as many people to farm, and allowed the Industrial Revolution. And then the Industrial Revolution kind of kept it going with new inventions. The third agricultural revolution is what we call the Green Revolution, has happened since World War II, and this is more what we talk about GMOs and much more modern ways of agriculture that we think of today. So I see, Neil, you're asking what economic forces impact agricultural practices. So it's just like a huge general question. So I'm going to go through this, and maybe you can ask more specifically or see if it gets answered in the course of this. So there are two basic forms of agriculture that exist: subsistence and commercial agriculture. So in a sense, Nelly, this maybe will partially answer your question. Subsistence agriculture is people that farm for themselves, like these Kenyans here on the left of your screen. If it's a really especially great harvest year, maybe they have a little extra they take to market, but the bottom line is subsistence farmers are producing food for their subsistence to eat. Commercial agriculture is where people are producing food very, very specifically to sell. This is like an Iowa cornfield. Now, you could be a family farmer, and commercial agriculture doesn't always have to be at this scale, but often, and most of it is in terms of land, in terms of money, things like that, in terms of food produced. I will point out it's not just, less developed countries, and Nelly, this is also getting more into your question. It's not only less developed countries are subsistence and more developed countries are commercial, because you also, in less developed places, have a lot of commercial agriculture for export, cash crop exports, coffee, sugar, bananas. This is a banana plantation in Costa Rica on the left there, and these are banana workers. So we in the West, in more developed places, are completely reliant on commercial agriculture around the world for things like chocolate and coffee and tea that we just are accustomed to being a part of our diet every day. So like examples of specific economic forces. Yeah, I can touch on that. And Nelly, I can touch on that right now. Just so Nelly's asking about economic forces that impact agricultural practices, and she said an example of specific economic forces such as government subsidies that encourage pesticides. So right now, what I would say is that in the United States, since the 70s, there's been a huge, or we're seeing it right now with Donald Trump, the rise of the trade war with China, which have tariffs here, tariffs there. For those that don't know what a trade war is, if one country puts tariffs on the goods of another, which are taxes on goods that are being imported. So we taxed Chinese steel because Donald Trump wanted to boost up the domestic United States steel production. I won't get into whether it was a good or a bad thing. This is not an economic class. And China responded by putting tariffs, taxes on imported agricultural goods from the United States, which had a huge impact on Midwestern farmers, because frankly, if you're China, you might say, you know what, we're going to buy soybeans from Brazil now, because they're without that tax, it's cheaper to buy them from Brazil. So then what the government did is it has thrown a lot of money into farmers' pockets to keep them afloat. So it would be one example of like a government subsidy. Another is just encouraging the production of corn by subsidizing it. So an example now would be like guaranteeing a minimum price to corn farmers so that the fluctuations of the market don't affect farmers so much. If they're granted subsidies, that's like an allowance from the government that guarantees a minimum price. So this has guaranteed a lot of corn production, which has changed our diets dramatically, the food we eat, corn and everything, also for fuel production and ethanol. So those are some examples of like government subsidies. That can have international impacts too, because then what happened along with the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, passed under Bill Clinton. It's been replaced by Donald Trump's, I forget what that new treaty is called that he replaced NAFTA with. But one thing this did in reducing the border restrictions of trade between Mexico and the US is US corn, because it could be sold for cheaper because the government was paying farmers to grow it in a sense. That cheap corn flooded into the Mexican market. A lot of Mexican farmers couldn't make it anymore. Some of them headed north to the border, often to work in maquiladoras. You guys didn't, industrialization and economic development are not on the exam, but that did lead into a rise in immigration into the US. So those are some examples of some economic forces that could be impacting how agriculture can kind of tie in. So, and the other thing right now is the battle over water. We see this hugely in California. So government decisions about who has access to water can definitely impact who farms, what farms, if it's viable to farm. Without huge water concessions, simply a lot of farms just couldn't exist in California right now. So I hope that that was helpful. So let me keep going here. Another type of agriculture is shifting cultivation, also called switting, or it can be known as slash and burn agriculture. Common in the tropics, where land is actually not very great for farming in rainforests. But yet what a lot of has happened traditionally is people will clear forest by cutting down the big stuff, that's the slash, then setting a controlled fire, that's the burn, burning all the low brush, and then the ash is kind of just tilled back in the soil, and now you have what was forest, now it's a place you can cultivate. The problem with this is that land, rainforest, the soil isn't really great. The rain leaches the nutrients out of the soil. It doesn't stay fertile very long. So soon, you gotta go and move on and do it to more forest. You could make the argument that this was a sustainable practice for thousands of years. This is not a new thing. And farmers were doing this in tropical regions. And in a sense, it was fine. It worked before the population just exploded as a result of, you could say, the second and third green revolution, agricultural revolutions, but particularly the third agricultural revolution that just created a huge rise in the population. Also, you can think of the demographic transition, but just all those things that have caused population to explode in places like Africa and India have made this not as sustainable as you maybe could argue it was at one point. Of course, agriculture happens in different ways in different parts of the world. Most of the Earth's surface is not it's not arable, it's not able to be farmed. When you look at deserts and the mountains and the dense forests and stuff, so you can see that it's quite limited really where it's farmable. And then of course you add climate to that. So and then we have a lot of uncertainty of this because we know the future has a lot of vulnerability. And there's, as you can see in this map, likely to be huge changes in agricultural productivity. And you see it in some scientists would say that certain parts of the world will actually be able to increase their agricultural yields as the climate changes. This is all very theoretical. Of course, we just don't know, but you see a lot of the places that are already food insecure, like Africa and India, according to this projection, are going to see, as a result of climate change, declines in their agricultural productivity. So this is definitely a worry as what the future of agriculture is. Now he's asking about the Green Revolution. Great. So the Green Revolution is often associated with a man named Norman Borlaug. He's kind of the poster child of the Green Revolution. He got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for, he was awarded for saving a lot of lives that would have died from starvation. But even in his Nobel speech, has a great line where he says that the positive effects of the Green Revolution might be ephemeral, like fleeting, go away very quickly, if we don't check the rapid human population growth. So one of the consequences of the Green Revolution has been a population explosion. What we've seen is where there's more food, population has just kept going up with the food supply. So positive effect, it created more food for more people. Negative effect, it's created more mouths to feed. More people having a bigger impact on the resources of the planet. Green Revolution technologies in agriculture require a lot of chemical input. So it's kind of meant to move from natural fertilizers more into chemical fertilizers. It's also associated with genetically modified organisms. So a lot of people are concerned, I would be one of those people, that we are eliminating the genetic diversity of the plants we eat. So if we are turning to this one amazing strain of soybean because the yield per acre is higher than all other soybeans because it's been genetically created in such a way to withstand, temperature fluctuations, or, well, what happens when the temperature fluctuations are outside of the, outside the realm of what that particular bean was engineered to withstand, and we eliminated other varieties in the process that maybe could have dealt with extreme heat spells or extreme flooding. So there's a lot of concerns that by going with single varieties of things, particularly genetically modified ones, we're taking away the genetic diversity of the foods we eat, which could, again, with all the climate change and the impacts of the environment on agriculture, could really end up screwing us in the end because we won't have the same genetic diversity. Other criticisms of the Green Revolution are that it left Africa behind by focusing on rice and corn. Was it rice and corn? It was definitely rice and corn in the beginning, but that the crops that were focused on in the Green Revolution early on were not crops that generally were grown in Africa, so this left a lot of Africans behind. This is one criticism of the Green Revolution. Another is that it favors corporations, and an example of this is that you need to have a lot of money to participate in Green Revolution agriculture because it requires a lot of fertilizers and a lot of chemical inputs and pesticides. So it leaves poor farmers behind and enriches corporations, and then that those chemicals also are in the environment. So sort of all the pros of organic agriculture are the flip side is the negatives of Green Revolution agriculture. So I hope that, and that's kind of an overview. I would say if you want, it's an AP World History DBQ from, I believe, 2011, but if you just Google AP World History DBQ Green Revolution, there was a DBQ that asked about positive and negative impacts. So if you read through these documents, particularly the ones at the end, there's a very compelling one by Vandana Shiva from The Ecologist magazine. There's one by a Guatemalan peasant organization of indigenous peasants saying this is our cultural heritage and it's being ripped away from us because we can't grow our traditional foods. So you could say that the Green Revolution has also taken away traditional cultures, both how people farmed and what they farmed. It's changed water politics because Green Revolution farming is very water intensive, things like that. So that's kind of the Green Revolution in a nutshell. And again, I think if you look at that DBQ, you can read some really compelling documents. Won't take you too long, and you'll have a better understanding of the Green Revolution. So I hope that was good, Manelli. More on here. Another thing we worry about with modern agriculture is water, and I see this hugely in the American West and in California, where we've largely, turned what was arid or semi-arid land into, some of the best farmland in the world, but we're also in a historic drought, and that drought is likely to continue or get worse in the future. So you see a lot of the world, and you can see over in Central Asia or in the Middle East there to the north. The biggest kind of example of this that was often pointed to is the Aral Sea, which all the rivers that fed into the Aral Sea, this is in the inland sea, where these rivers were diverted for cotton cultivation and agriculture by the Soviet Union, and the Aral Sea has just completely dried up, became very salinated, that much of the salt content went up. So really dramatic pictures of that. You can see maps over time that show this shrinking water as this inland sea just really largely disappeared. You see boats grounded and things like that. So a lot of fear that the world is, in many places, are being desertified and suffering desertification. So this is one of the concerns with careless water use that comes out of Green Revolution agriculture now. And then just a quick kind of overview of what's happened with agriculture. I think over time, we could say from, and largely with the Green Revolution, some of this, the second agricultural revolution, but much of it the third, is this move from, people farming with their hands toward more mechanization. And, I talked about like banana and coffee plantations. One of the things that's happening around, the less affluent parts of the world is people are losing access to the best lands. They're either becoming plantation workers or having to sell their land, or they're turning themselves over to cash crop. So these people that traditionally, worked on small plots are turning to large corporate-owned holdings. So this is not just in the West, this is worldwide, becoming more mechanized, moving away from zero fertilizers toward natural fertilizers, compost, guano, chicken poop, animal poop, human poop, toward more chemical fertilizers, away from natural seed production, seed banks, storing one's seeds, toward GMOs and hybrid seeds, farming for your family, to farming toward more commercial, toward other people, taking control of water resources, much more use of control of water. And again, this huge shift from low yield to high yield. So that is arguably the good thing, is we are able to produce a lot more food through all these things. So, we see some negatives in what we're doing, and yet the result is we could absolutely feed the whole planet easily with all the food we're producing. It's a distribution issue, getting it to people. And then the question is this sustainable environmentally and to keep farming this way? I think this is incredibly unlikely that, I'm going to actually, I think it's quite unlikely that this would show up, but these are known as cadastral systems, different ways land has been divided. On the far left there, you see the township and range system, which is used in a lot of our country, which was split up into just a basic grid of single square miles, 1 by 1 mile, each one having 640 acres that were split into 36. And then you had a township of 36 of these squares, which were administrative districts. And this is why you see that a lot of the Midwest looks like that picture below of Kansas. I think that's Kansas. In the middle, you have what are called long lots. And this is where lots are divided to really give access to transportation, either river or road. So you can see that if like each farmer that had each one of these long lots would have the same kind of access to the river for transport. and to get to the mill to some degree, or if there's some kind of road that would connect to that mill. And then on the right, actually, that map, you can see those meridians and baselines. That shows the township and range, but at the very, very top of that, which that smaller part that says meets and bounds, that was traditionally, like in the beginning of our country in New England, how a lot of land was divided by, oh, you know, my land begins by the big oak tree and goes down to the creek, and really using natural features to demarcate usually irregular pieces of land. Important to say that the long lot in the middle, that, you know, is really about access to rivers, roads, canals, common in French places. So we see this in our country mostly in places with French influence, like Louisiana. And I still will get to Abigail to Ravenstein's laws of migration in the last minute. So let me just do von Thunen's model, and then I'll go into Ravenstein's laws of migration. So I've put two examples of this because it's changed slightly. So the one on the right is maybe a little more modern than the one on the left because things have changed. But von Thunen was a German economist who was trying to understand why different types of agriculture appeared where they did. And it was all about the cost of land and transportation. So that in this case, the center, that red circle, we're talking about the one on the left here, is the market or the city where everything is being produced for. The immediate ring around that was what we call market gardening, or here they call horticulture or dairying, things that were being done very intensively. Things like growing tomatoes or strawberries that this was, remember, before refrigeration. So we're talking about things that are highly perishable and also things that really are high value per weight. If you're growing strawberries really far from the market, I mean, you wouldn't be able to get them to market in a decent state of affairs, so nobody would buy them, and so it wouldn't make sense. So these tend to happen close to the market, also where land is more expensive. Outside that ring was a forest ring in von Thunen's traditional model because people relied on that for fuel. And then you got into more extensive crops that needed a lot more space and where land was less expensive, like the grains. And as you got way further out, then you got into livestock and grazing, where again you needed lots and lots of land. And you could even bring your animals to market and then slaughter them so they could be their own transportation. So this had to do with the ability to transport your produce into town. So I'm gonna, I have a slide, I think it was Abigail that asked about Ravenstein's laws of migration. So I have to jump back and just find where that is. So bear with me. I'm going to just fly through. There it is. So this is called the gravity model, also known as Ravenstein's laws of migration. I'll say really quickly about migration. We talk about, I'll say this really quickly, push and pull factors, which are things that cause people to come to a place. Those are pull factors, like great opportunities, or you already know people there, you have family there, good wages, freedom from persecution. Those are the types of things that would pull somebody to a place. Push factors are things that would cause people to flee a place, like an environmental catastrophe, a war, religious persecution, or cultural or political persecution. And Ravenstein came up with this model to describe what he was seeing, which I'll go in order of the 5. One is that every migration flow does generate a counter migration, that some people say, you know what, it was better back there, I'm going home. And every migration has a counter migration we observe. He also said that the vast majority of migrants are only moving short distances. We have to remember migration is hard. So a huge amount of migration is not emigration or immigration. It's internal migration, domestic migration, where people are moving from country to town, or from a town to a bigger town, or from country to city. And that's a huge amount of migration we've seen in recent centuries has simply been from country to city. When people move great distances, kind of obvious for the third, but it's pretty rare that people migrate into the country. Most long distance migration tends to be big city destinations. That also explains why urban residents tend to be less migratory than inhabitants of rural areas, and that families are less likely to make international moves than young adults. That's mostly was migrating that Ravenstein was observing. It's not a perfect model that matches everything that's gone on or continues to go on. We've seen some things change this, but it is true still that it is easier for single men to migrate than families, and people send money, and this is still a phenomenon. But of course, local conditions and recent developments have thrown his model a little bit into disarray. So it's not a perfect model, but that is Ravenstein's model. So I'm going to cut it off. It's 10, unless there's a last question. I'll just kind of give it a minute if anybody has a last question. I think, let me just make sure I answered all of them. Sorry, I ignored the primate city questions because they're simply not in the exam. You can just Google it, but I didn't want to take the time. But in a nutshell, a primate city is the biggest and most important city in a country that it doesn't have another city that's even half that size. So like Paris or New York or Cairo, Egypt. I think I did answer all these questions. So why are many countries highly dependent upon a single export commodity? Now he's asking that. So now a lot of that is just specific economic conditions, and some of that is kind of post-colonial politics and the world market, and that a lot of the more developed countries have created a sense of economic dependence from less developed countries, so that when a place like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which had just huge copper reserves, was granted its independence. Some of it is incentives that come from things like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that encourage countries to develop a structure around a single commodity that the more developed countries, where we talk about core and periphery, if that's something that came into your classes, that the core countries require certain things from the periphery, and often economic conditions are created that encourage the development of those single commodities for the needs of the core markets. So whether it's an agricultural commodity like coffee or bananas, or a mineral resource, I would say that's really a matter of just kind of politics and economics, and power being wielded in such a way that creates kind of economic dependence on that single commodity in a way that serves the core countries, and does serve elites in those periphery countries, but is also very vulnerable, because if the market changes, or right now all of a sudden, I don't know, no one's having Starbucks and the coffee prices go down, or we see oil prices plummeting. If you were a single export commodity economy, then you're going to have hell to pay. So I hope that's a good answer, Nelly. And I wish you guys amazing luck on the exam next week, and good luck with your health and everything. Everybody stay safe and healthy, and have a good day. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody. And remember, Amanda, Q&A tonight, or free response tips and tricks, and then Monday, the big cram session if you have cram pass. Bye-bye. And I've posted, do you see a link there to this PowerPoint? You can kind of run through it and maybe get an overview of the population, culture, migration stuff that we didn't cover. So good luck on the exam. Ciao.